The Polish Jewish Exchange Program is a program that was initiated more than a decade ago. The concept here is that a group of Poles, prominent Poles, are selected to come to the United States for an intensive Jewish experience. They are taken to New York, Washington, and at least one other city. They're introduced to the Jewish community. They receive a real background in all kinds of issues, as well as issues related to the United States. At the same time, and that's every spring. Every summer, a group of AJC leaders goes to Poland. Those leaders are chosen because they are nominated by their region. They have to be giving at the $5,000 level or above, but that's the only basic criteria. They're chosen by a committee, and it is competitive, but quite a number of people from our region have gone. And part of my reason for doing this call and making this so visible is because I hope that more people will decide to go on this trip. It's really a unique, historic, transformative experience. I know it's tough to take a week out of your vacation schedules, but certainly at least once, if you see yourself as an AJC leader, you should consider this or the Adenauer program, which is also an exchange program and takes place every April in Berlin, in Germany. The decision to have me staff this trip was a last-minute decision. The person who was supposed to staff it, Jonathan Neerman, the development director in Boston, he had gone last summer. Some of you may know Gosia. Gosia is a staff person originally from Poland in our LA office, and she had staffed it for many years. She was leaving the organization to raise her young children, and the decision was that we should send somebody with her to train with her last summer. At the last minute, it turned out that there was an issue with him, and he wasn't able to go, so they asked me to staff it. It turned out to be fortuitous for me because it was an extraordinary experience, but definitely last minute, so not so easy to kind of pick up. And we'll see where it goes in terms of the future and who's staffing it. It was not my first trip to Poland. It was actually my 5th trip. I made my first trip as a student at Hebrew University in 1988. In the summer of 1988, I had taken a trip called a class called Cultural Legacy of East European Jewry with a really legendary professor at Hebrew University. And she decided to take the entire class to Poland, as well as Austria and Hungary. But most of the trip was to Poland. We spent 7 days in communist Poland, and there were 78 of us, 78 students. So it was really an extraordinary experience for me. I learned a lot then, and obviously I have the basis of comparison. I made other trips to Poland, not in connection with my work with AJC, but in connection with my work with JDC, where I used to work before this. But my last trip there was in 2004. We were a delegation of 10 people, 9 lay leaders and me. The lay leaders were from across the country. The trip is limited to 10 people, and we had 10, but at the last minute, something came up with one of the participants. But we had lay leaders from across the country, from San Francisco, from Atlanta, from Washington, from Chicago, from St. Louis, and from Palm Beach. The goal of the experience is really to build bridges of understanding between Poles and Jews. So that's really the basic idea of it, and that's why a group of Poles go here and a group of Jewish leaders go there. Obviously, over the years, there are many, many people who've done this trip, and they feel that changing hearts and minds, one person at a time, is important. And then those people are people who are connected within their communities and can really be ambassadors and speak about the experience to the many people that they're in touch with. There are many stereotypes that are floating around about Poles. They recognize that. Our partner organization is an organization called Forum for Dialogue, and their role is really to dispel those myths. It was started by a man named Andrzej, and Andrzej had a terrible experience many, many years ago. He was a professional. He was not connected to this work at all. He's not Jewish, but he had a terrible experience whereby he encountered a group of Jews, and he happened to be with a mixed group from Europe, and they seemed to welcome the German delegate warmly, and he got the cold shoulder, and he realized that something was very amiss here in terms of their understanding of history and in terms of their understanding of Poles. He started a nonprofit organization, which is now 20 years old and does a lot more than this, which I'll explain, but that's sort of the basic idea. I really can't encapsulate the full trip. There's really too much to say. It's a huge amount of information that's coming at us. Many, many meetings, many encounters, many visits, many historic sites. What I decided to do, I've picked 5 themes of the experience, and I've decided to divide this presentation into 5 themes that will somehow elucidate a lot of what I think is important, and you'll have to go if you want the full experience. So theme 1. Theme 1 is efforts by the Poles to recapture what was lost, to understand the fact that there was a huge Jewish history for more than 1,000 years, that Jewish history and Polish history were intimately tied, that so much of their intellectual and cultural underpinnings comes from the Jews who were there, and it was very abruptly cut off. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'll do this periodically. Sorry for those of you on the phone who can't see this, but in this case I will read it. So this was, this was a statement that was at a museum that we went to, and I think it kind of encapsulates exactly what's going on here. So I'll read it for those of you who are on the phone. Jews who come here ask us, why do you do this? After all, you're not Jewish. Instead of talking to the Poles, you are Poles, and the Jewish town is not your history. Poles ask us, why do you do this? After all, you are Poles, and the Jewish town is not our history. Or maybe you are Jewish. We explain patiently that it is our common Polish-Jewish history to remember the murdered Jews. You do not have to be Jewish. So this is the idea. They're trying to somehow recapture what was lost, a bit like a phantom limb that's there. They know it's there, they feel it, and they somehow want to recapture a bit of it. I'll explain a lot more about that as I go along, but that's sort of the basic idea. So the Forum for Dialogue, as I said, is our partner organization. The Forum for Dialogue does a lot of things. They don't just lead trips. I'll tell you about one very important thing that they do, and I think it'll be very telling in terms of this idea of recapturing what was lost. A very big program of theirs is to go into the high schools, and they look for a group of students in high schools who will be their ambassadors. They choose 40 high schools a year, and in those high schools, with these ambassadors, they're delving deeply into the Jewish history of their town. So you're talking about 40 towns over the course of a year, and you're looking at how many Jews were there, what happened to the Jews, where did they live, what did they do, where was the Jewish cemetery, did you know that the cinema in the town was actually a synagogue, you know, all of these things. So trying to reach out to a group of young people and get them to really understand the Jewish history that used to exist in this town. You can imagine 40 schools, 40 towns that they choose in 1 year, but they've been doing this for 20 years. So they've now gone through many, many, many towns and many, many, many students, and they're really one person at a time trying to rebuild Jewish life and an understanding of Jewish life. And the idea that is that these students will be ambassadors and that they'll be telling everybody else in their town what used to exist here. That's pretty extraordinary. They have, the Forum for Dialogue has a board of directors. We had Home Hospitality with the board of directors. They're an extraordinary group. These are people who are supporting this effort. The person that I spent a good part of the evening with is the president of Pfizer in Poland. Some of them have Jewish roots, they know it. Some of them don't, and they're just doing this because they feel compelled to do it. I want to just say that I find this effort to be extraordinary and unique. My area of focus for many years was the former Soviet Union. There were certainly many Jews living in Ukraine and in Belarus and places like that. I never saw this kind of effort. This is really something that I was not so aware of to this extent, and I find it to be extraordinary. You have groups of average Poles who are deeply, deeply interested. By and large, this is an effort of non-Jews. This is really not being orchestrated or pushed forward at all by any Jewish institution. This is really all coming from non-Jews, and Forum for Dialogue is a big piece of it. Now I'm going to talk a lot more about the exact details of the trip, and I'm going to start with something that I think is very emblematic of what I just said, which is the Krakow Jewish Festival. We happened to be there during the biggest festival of the year. The trip doesn't always coincide with it, but it did this year. So for years, they've been holding a Jewish festival in Krakow. Again, a festival by non-Jews and for non-Jews. Some Jews come because they want to see the spectacle, but this is really by non-Jews for non-Jews. I'm going to share my screen again. And if I can make that move. Yeah. So there you go. This is an image of the closing concert at the Krakow Jewish Festival. There were 30,000 people there. All of the music is Jewish music. These are not Jews. These are Poles who are all coming out. The area that you see there is the Jewish Quarter, the traditional Jewish Quarter. It's a bit like Disneyland now. Many restaurants that have a Jewish theme to it. I'll show you another picture. Because it was the festival, they're very focused on tours, and these are little tour buses that are going around. You see Schindler's Factory is what it says at the end of that awning, the Jewish Quarter, the Old Town. So you have this kind of Disneyland feel of showing what Jewish life used to be like. Pretty extraordinary. Now, it was not just that there was this major concert. The festival is much, much more than that. You have a week's worth of programming. People can learn how to bake challah. They can learn how to knit kippot. They can take text study classes. They can do anything. There were quite a number of Jewish celebrities around. Deborah Lipstadt was there. Yossi Klein Halevi was there. If these names mean anything, Sam Kassow was there. Some of you may recall that I interviewed him on stage at the Jewish Film Festival because he's the writer of Who Will Write Our History. These people were there because they were presenting as part of the week, and we saw them all. We saw them all because we went to Shabbat dinner. Shabbat dinner with 750 people on Friday night. This concert was on Saturday night, but Friday night there was a Shabbat dinner put on by the JCC of Krakow, with 750 people in attendance, largely non-Jews. The Poland Museum fits into this category as well. So the Poland Museum is a museum in Warsaw, relatively new. The goal was to recapture 1,000 years of Jewish history. People focus very much on the years of the Holocaust, but there was much more to the history of Poland than just the 5 years of the Holocaust or 6 years of the Holocaust. So the Poland Museum tries to capture that. It's very, very well done, very comprehensive. You get an extraordinary view of what that means, 1,000 years of Jewish life. There are many pieces to it, why the Jews moved there, what they did, what they experienced, and it's quite a comprehensive museum. That's some of our group right in front with our tour guide. And here's an image of 3 people from our group. The woman on the left is from Palm Beach, Nancy Yanofsky, Craig Kaufman in the middle from Atlanta, and Stephanie Liss from Chicago, and you can see them with the mezuzah from the Poland Museum. And this is Bob Stein from St. Louis. This is a recreated synagogue, recreated from photos, and it's inside the Poland Museum. Some of you may remember the documentary that we showed at the Jewish Film Festival about the making of this particular piece of the Poland Museum. Okay, so before I get to that, I'm going to stop the share for a second. With all of this said, I think what I said is fairly extraordinary in terms of people trying to recapture what was lost. But there's one place that I found to be so extraordinary that I want to end this segment by talking about this place. So Lublin is a town in southern part of Poland that had 43,000 Jews on the eve of the war. Obviously, they were all killed or left. We went to Lublin, and as you come into the town, you come into what was traditionally the Jewish quarter. It's now a parking lot. They really didn't rebuild the area that was the Jewish quarter. They left it sort of open. There's a place called the Grodzka Gate. Grodzka Gate, it was a gate, traditional gate to the city of Lublin. It's now a museum. It's a museum to the community that was lost, but it's a lot more than that. It's an effort by the Lublin community to recreate person by person, street by street, everything they possibly can about Jewish life. There were 43,000 Jews. They have 43,000 files set up inside the Grodzka Gate, one for each person, and they are desperate to find any piece of information about any one of them, and they stick it into the file. They have interviews with all kinds of elderly people that they've been doing for many, many years about the Jewish community, about this particular house, or this particular street, or what was the synagogue, or any topic you can think of. They have interviews about it, and it's all cataloged that way. So I'm going to share my screen again, and you can see, sorry, you can see this is our tour guide right here, and you could see all of these files. Every room in the museum has files. This is just one small section of the files, and they all correspond to a person who was living in that town in 1939 before the war started. This to me is really an unbelievable effort. If I go to the next one, you could see here on the wall are little speakers, and it was in Polish, so we weren't able to understand it, but if you click on the button that's next to the speaker, you're going to get a slice of life. So I put one of them in the corner here, and you could see. So Ulica is the word for street. And Żarówka is the main street that went through the Jewish quarter. So if you press this button here, you're going to hear a person's perspective on what the main street going through the Jewish quarter was like on the eve of the war. Literally trying to recapture every bit of life and people and society of what was. To me, that was really extraordinary and a bit emblematic of what's unique in terms of what's going on. There are many, many people like that. Forum for Dialogue, the guides that we had throughout are all examples of this. Okay, so that's theme 1. Theme 2 is Poland today. So Poland today is, you know what, before I even talk about Poland today, I want to give you a very, very brief understanding of Polish history, because I think it's important. So Poland went through a bit of a golden age in the 14, 15, 1600s. They had combined with Lithuania. They had an enormous landmass. They were very wealthy. This was the time when the vast majority of Jews were coming there. They welcomed the Jews. They welcomed the Jews as traders, as people who were connected. They recognized the value of the Jews. And of course, you know what was happening to the Jews elsewhere. They were being expelled. So there's a reason why so many Jews trace their roots to Poland. The problem was that in 1795, Poland was partitioned. So for years, there had been sort of the growth of empires growing around Poland. And we know that the 1800s were a period when empires really ruled a good part of Europe and Asia. And that was the political construct. World War I blew that apart, but really for much of the 1800s, that's how things were ruled. You had the Russian Empire, you had the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the German Empire, the Italian Empire. That's how things were politically organized. So what happened was these empires began to encroach and build themselves. In the case of Poland, it was partitioned. So the German Empire took a piece, the Austro-Hungarian Empire took a piece, German Empire in the west, the Austro-Hungarian in the south, and the Russian Empire in the east. So Warsaw was a part of the east. That went to Russia. Krakow was a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So these places kind of grew up very, very differently. What happened was the Russian Empire suddenly found themselves with a lot of Jews, and they didn't know what to do with all of these Jews. They'd never had Jews in their boundaries before, and they decided to create something called the Pale of Settlement. So that's where that phrase comes from. They decided to confine the Jews to where they were basically living in any case, which is what now had become the western part of their empire. So they weren't allowed to go into the traditional parts of Russia, certainly not allowed to go into Moscow without special permission. And this is an area that stretches, a strip of land that stretches from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. So that's where the vast majority of Jews were confined until many of them began emigrating, mostly to this country, 2 million of them, starting in the 1880s with the assassination of Tsar Nicholas. So what happened, though, was that World War I really blew this idea of empires apart, and sovereign nations became the way that people were organizing themselves, people who wanted to organize themselves by culture, by language, and many, many new countries came up, and Poland was once again allowed to be free. So in the interwar years, from 1918 until 1939, they were a sovereign nation with their own boundaries, although quite a bit smaller than they had been before 1795. Many of you know the history after that. They were taken by the Soviets. Soviets very quickly, with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, had an agreement with the Germans. Germans took part of the country, and the Soviets took part of the country, and that was that. And then, of course, once that pact was broken, the Nazis overran the entire country and all the way up into to Lithuania. And then, of course, the Iron Curtain fell, communism, and it wasn't until 1989 when they were once again a sovereign nation. So very little time in their history that they've been a sovereign nation since the 1700s. I can tell you from firsthand experience, since I was there in 1988, that Poland was not a prosperous country when communism ended. They were a very poor country. They did not know how to be a democracy. Where they have gone, and besides all, not just being poor, they had incredibly high debt, incredibly high inflation, incredibly high unemployment, and they worked very, very hard. They really imposed draconian measures, a lot of austerity. The years through the 90s were terrible years for Poles as they were trying to rediscover themselves and trying to build their economy. I can say now that Poland is in an extraordinary place, at least in terms of its economy. And many people compare it to Ukraine, its neighbor. It is now the 8th largest economy in Europe. Its GDP is growing at last year in 2018, it grew at 5.1%, and it has almost full employment. That's unbelievable, considering where it was in the recent past. Thanks to World War II, Poland was a very multicultural society before the war, but thanks to World War II, it's become a very homogeneous society, partially because so many of the different minorities were either pushed out or killed, and because its borders shrunk. So at this point, 97% of the people living in Poland are Poles, Poles who are Catholic. And the largest minority besides the Poles are Ukrainians living there either legally or illegally. They've almost no Muslims. They've almost none of this migration from the Middle East or North Africa that other European countries have experienced, mostly because they haven't let them in. Poland is a very Catholic country. The church is extremely powerful, and part of the reason that they have such a conservative government in place right now is because that's what the church wants. They're very, very proud of Pope John Paul, who was the first non-Western or non-Italian, actually, Pope in 500 years. Many people believe that that was a sort of a political decision that he was chosen, and that he was chosen specifically to try and end communism. The church's conservative leanings are really, as I say, the reason that the Law and Justice Party is so powerful. So the Law and Justice Party is the current party in power. They're nationalistic. They are opposed to immigrants. They're opposed to LGBT rights, among other attributes. And we had a briefing from an anti-Semitism expert who basically said to us, once you boost one form of hatred for the other, meaning for immigrants, LGBT, or whatever group you want to say, you are going to boost your hatred for the other in general. And he feels that that's the reason that anti-Semitism has increased with the advent of the Law and Justice Party. Law and Justice Party is run by a president, President Duda. There's also a prime minister, Prime Minister Morawiecki, but the real power is wielded by the chairman of the Law and Justice Party, who has a cult-like following. His name is Kaczynski. Kaczynski is, his name is Yaroslav Kaczynski, but his brother was Lech Kaczynski, and Lech Kaczynski was killed in a famous plane crash, you may recall, in 2010 over Russia. And that's part of the reason he's developed a cult-like following, because there's a conspiracy theory out there that this plane crash, which had much of the government in it, was done on purpose by the Russians. They hate the Russians. I can't express that more. They have been their occupiers. They have been their tormentors for centuries. And it's the same in Lithuania, which was my second destination. Those in the big cities are opposed to the current government. We have a bit of this phenomenon in the United States as well, with a populist government that's supported by those outside of some of the big cities. So many of the people that we met with, because we were principally in Warsaw and Krakow, most of them were opposed to the government. That was the impression we got. But of course, this government is very, very popular. So it's not. It's just a matter of who we met with. On the other hand, as I say, the economy is very strong, but there's more to it than that. They are very supportive of Israel. They feel close to Israel, the government, and they feel close to the United States. In fact, we met with somebody from the U.S. Embassy who told us that there is no more supportive country of the United States than Poland, at least in his view. Obviously, President Trump it's related to that. And by the way, they give more than 2% of their GDP to defense, which makes President Trump very happy. So I will end that all with a phrase that we heard again and again and again. It's very, very complicated, the situation. And once you feel you have it, you're going to be something's going to happen to show you that the situation is perhaps quite different than the way you see it. But the purpose of this trip and the way Forum for Dialogue expresses it is that they are hoping that Poland will go from being black and white in your mind to colorful or colored Poland. So with that in mind, I'm going to share my screen again and show you a bit of Poland in color. Oh, all right. So there you go. This is the old city in Warsaw. I would imagine that this is not exactly the kind of image that you have of Poland, but that's the reality. And Warsaw is quite a beautiful city. 40% of it is parks. Really a lovely place to walk around. A lot of bike lanes now. It's not exactly the image that I even had, even though I had been there. It's changed quite a bit. This is Lublin. This is that traditional Jewish quarter. So it's now a big parking lot, but you would have to envision it with homes and tight alleyways and tight streets. But it was all destroyed during the war, and this is how they rebuilt it. And this is Krakow. It's really a beautiful, beautiful city. Krakow, while Warsaw is seen as the business capital of Poland, Krakow is seen as the spiritual capital of Poland. It's the city of kings. It's where the kings traditionally sat. And several centuries ago, the capital was moved to Warsaw, but this is seen as that traditional spiritual nexus. And there is a beautiful river running through it, and there are castles, and this really is what it looks like. So I'm going to move on to the third theme. And the third theme is something really completely different from what I've been discussing. The third theme is advocacy. Forum for Dialogue is a purely educational, and the Polish Jewish Exchange is a wholly educational experience. It's an educational seminar. Same with Adenauer. And for the most part, the same with many of the trips that AJC runs. However, we were faced with a situation, and a decision was made that our group was going to engage in advocacy, and it wasn't just going to be purely educational. I will explain. So I showed you the picture of the Poland Museum, very important institution. There's a director of the Poland Museum who's been there since its founding in 2013. His name is Professor Stola, Dr. Stola. Dr. Stola, as you can imagine, living in Warsaw and being the director of the Poland Museum, is left of center. He's not extreme, but he is left of center. He's not a big supporter of the government. He was put on an advisory council by the president, and he sat on it for a little bit, but he withdrew himself in protest, but not in any kind of outright way. His term ended. When his term ended, the decision about who should replace him was, there was a bit of controversy about it. It was ultimately decided that the three players involved, the city of Warsaw, the government of Poland, and the Jewish community essentially, would come together and would decide jointly who should be the next director of the museum, and everybody would abide by that decision. The decision is actually made by the Minister of Culture, a man named Glinski. Glinski had been giving indications that he wasn't interested in reinstating Stola, and AJC has been advocating quietly behind the scenes for more than 6 months to have him be reinstated. It included various letters to Glinski, as well as a meeting with the president. You may be aware that a few weeks ago, President Duda was in the United States visiting with President Trump. We had a private meeting with him, and a private meeting at which the issue of the director of the Poland Museum was raised as a very important issue. And President Duda was aware of the fact that Stola had withdrawn from the advisory council. So this may seem like something very obscure, but it's not at all. We met, as I said, with the people from the US Embassy. We raised this issue with the people from the US Embassy. They were 100% aware of it and are also working behind the scenes to get him reinstated. The situation is such that in May, this group met. There were 11 delegates to this group, and a majority of them chose to reinstate Stola. So the feeling was he would be reinstated because everybody agreed to abide by their decision. It's now been well over a month, and Glinsky has not reinstated him. So AJC needed to act once again, and there was a lot of chatter just as we were arriving about what to do. David Harris was considering doing an op-ed in the major newspaper, but in the end, we chatted about it. We decided that this group should take a stand. It's not something that we normally do, as I say, with the Polish Jewish Exchange. What did that mean? It meant that at the end of the evening on Monday night, I sat with the group, I explained the whole situation to them, and I put in front of them a letter which was from them to the deputy foreign minister. Why? Because we were meeting with the deputy foreign minister the next day, most important government official with whom we met, and the idea was that we were going to explain that this was going to hurt relations with world Jewry, and therefore it's within the province of the foreign minister. So we're meeting with the deputy foreign minister and asking him to present this letter to his foreign minister, who would then put pressure on his fellow culture minister to reinstate Professor Stola. The idea was that we were all going to sign this letter, and it was going to be very, very, very obvious. In true AJC leader fashion, they read the letter and they had changes to it. So I was very proud of the group, and we made those changes. And the following day, we actually, let me share my screen, and I'll tell you the story while you have an image in front of you. So this is actually the meeting with the U.S. Embassy official. And by the way, we mentioned to him that we were going to do this, and he was extremely supportive of that. He thought that was a very good move, and he mentioned to us how important the deputy foreign minister is. His name is Minister Maciej Lang. So this is our meeting with Lang. This is him in the center next to me. I was the one who presented it at the meeting. He accepted it warmly, graciously. We talked it through a little bit with him, and presumably he presented it to his foreign minister. But the story didn't end there, and that's very important. And actually, I'll show you right here. This is the actual letter. So you can see it's 2 pages. On the left is most of the text, and on the right you see all of our signatures. It's the 9 of us, 9 of the AJC leaders, plus me, plus Sebastian. So Sebastian Reak is the acting director of AJC's Central Europe office, our office in Warsaw. So that's the full group that signed it. But it didn't end there. Why didn't it end there? Because Sebastian passed it to the newspaper. And we specifically wrote, if you can see, open letter concerning appointment of a new director. So I was not so focused on this, but open letter is what you put in a letter to say that this is going to be open to the public. We took the deputy editor of Gazeta Wyborska, which is the largest circulation daily newspaper in Poland. We happened to have taken him on a project interchange trip in April. So very close with him. We passed him the letter. The following day, that letter appeared in the largest circulation newspaper. The group became famous overnight, literally overnight. Many, many, many comments if you go to the site, which are easily translatable. And I would say that much of the dinner and lunch conversation revolved around us sort of looking at all the comments, some of them quite supportive and some of them quite nasty and anti-Semitic. The last thing I'll say is that the following day, which was Thursday, so this was on Tuesday, so Thursday, 2 weeks ago, this was, they lifted out the piece about how this is going to affect world Jewry, and that was the quote of the day. So the controversy continued. Everybody knew about this letter. By the time we got to Krakow and we're at that 750-person Shabbat dinner, everybody was talking to us about that letter. It became quite famous. With all of that, though, I will say that we probably didn't change any minds. The government, I'm sure, doesn't like that kind of pressure. We need to do what we need to do, which we felt was the right thing. But we asked the ambassador or the embassy official, U.S. embassy official, if we did this, might that change the views? Might Glinsky actually appoint this person? And the answer was, well, probably not. And probably there's going to be a series of interim appointments until perhaps the Law and Justice Party is no longer out of in the government. But in any case, we did what we felt was right. The group was quite afraid that they were going to get to the airport and not be allowed to leave. Sort of a throwback to the way things happened in the Soviet Union. And I can show you here. This is the quote of the day. It's right here, and that was that quote about it affecting international Jewry. Okay, so I'm going to go to theme 4. So theme 4 is the Shoah, the Holocaust. Obviously, this was ever present throughout the trip. There's absolutely no way to avoid it. And frankly, it is ever present in Poland and certainly everywhere that we went. I'm going to share my screen again and say how ever present it was. This is in Warsaw. This is a remnant of the ghetto wall. So here's the ghetto wall as it existed during the war. And you see these beautiful apartment buildings that have gone up around it. This is where people live. They see this every day. There are plaques there. They know exactly what it is. You can see a beautiful office building in the background. Poland, Warsaw has grown up. They haven't forgotten their history, but they really do live with it. And I'll go one more. This is Mila 18. Many of you know Mila 18 from the Leon Uris book. So this was where the sort of the headquarters of the group that was doing the ghetto uprising in 1943. And you could see huge nice apartment buildings right behind it, and this is their view. They're overlooking this monument which was created shortly after the war to Mila 18. The Holocaust law, which many of you perhaps know about, sorry, okay. The Holocaust law, which many of you know about, was also much talked about on the trip. This is this idea of accusing Poles of perpetrating the Holocaust, of being responsible for the Holocaust, and the idea that criminal penalties will be imposed for those who do that. This is part of this nationalist government who felt that this was the right thing to do. That was eventually toned down, largely because of protests from the United States and from Israel. And now it's no longer it no longer has criminal penalties. It actually has not been it's not been enforced in any way, but certainly it was talked about. Part of what's important here to understand is that from the Polish perspective, this was the idea of them perpetrating the Holocaust is a huge affront to them. They were occupied. When they were occupied, they completely resisted. Unlike many governments in Europe, they chose not to capitulate. You've heard the term Quisling, a Quisling government. That comes from the idea of capitulation to the Nazis. Lithuania, their neighbor, did capitulate and became an Axis power, but not Poland. They never agreed to Nazi rule. It was forced on them, but they never agreed to it. They maintained the government in exile, and they maintained huge resistance efforts. Whilst 3 million Polish Jews perished in the war, 3 million Poles also perished in the war. So they focus on 6 million people of Polish citizenship who were killed in the war. I visited the Uprising Museum before the group came. So for them, this is a huge piece of their history, not the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, but the Warsaw Uprising. In 1944, the city of Warsaw rose up against the Nazis. It was brutally suppressed. It's a huge piece of their history. And in return, Hitler chose to absolutely destroy Warsaw. Absolutely, 80% of the buildings were leveled in Warsaw. You can't imagine what it looked like at the end of the war. It was simply rubble. There were almost no buildings standing. Every building you see is a building that was either built anew in the 50s or rebuilt in the 50s or 60s. And I'm going to share my screen again, and I'm going to show you what our guide showed us. Whoops. So here, this is our guide showing us images of Warsaw, and all you see are piles of rubble. And here you can see one building that happened to still be standing. But this was the retribution. There was still some of Warsaw standing in 1944 before the uprising, but after the uprising, Hitler gave the orders to completely demolish the entire city. So it's very, very complicated. In addition to the fact that they were victims, they were also perpetrators. Many of you know the story of Jedwabne. This was a place where the Poles had gathered the Jews in the synagogue, 1,500 Jews, and burnt them to death. The feeling is that they did it at the instigation of the Nazis, but nevertheless, there were many instances of Poles doing things like this. So it's extraordinarily complicated, and you have the story of righteous Gentiles. So there are more than 6,000 Polish citizens who are recognized by Yad Vashem as righteous Gentiles. They have created a brand new museum, which we visited, in a city called Markowa. Markowa is in the south of the country. It's a museum to righteous Gentiles. And here you see at the entrance to the museum, these are all the righteous Gentiles from this region, which is the sort of southeast corner of Poland. And there's a whole museum to all the righteous Gentiles and all the stories of people that were saved. You can imagine that the penalties were very, very severe for those who helped Jews. They were killed, their families were killed. So, you know, it was not just a matter of having a choice. You had to go through extremes, and quite a number of the people in this museum who were recognized were killed by the Nazis for their role helping Jews. So very complicated. And their attempt to legislate around it, their attempt to legislate around it with this law, of course, is wrong, but you can see a bit of their impetus. We met with the outgoing Israeli ambassador. Her name is Anna Azari. She basically expressed to us the fact that she was fine for the, go back to that. She was fine, she said, for the first 3.5 years of her, this is our meeting with her, it's a photo of our meeting with her, she's in the center, for the first 3.5 years of her tenure, and then everything exploded with this law a 1.5 years ago. It obviously has not been the same since. She said that given the emotions that exist around Poland, this is just going to continue to be the case, where there's going to be rise and fall of relations between Jews and Poles, and it is what it is. Of course, the biggest aspect of the Shoah that was a part of our trip was our visit to Auschwitz. Auschwitz was a place that I went to on July 4th, 1988. I wrote an essay about the fact that I was there on Independence Day, and I compared it. And I never thought I'd be going back there. Unfortunately, I did go back there, and it's as devastating today as it was then. It has not changed. It has truly not changed. The museum at Auschwitz was established by the survivors in 1947. The exhibits were mostly created in the 50s, and for the most part, it hasn't changed. I think that's purposeful. I think they wanted to look as it did then. So what I saw in 1988 was almost exactly what I saw today. Poles go there. There are almost 2 million visitors a year to Auschwitz, and the vast majority of them are Poles. And of course, there were many, many Poles at the camp. This was not just a camp for Jews. Our guide, actually, his grandfather was killed. He's not Jewish. His grandfather was killed at the camp. His father was interned at the camp and ended up becoming the director of the museum. And now his son is continuing his legacy by being a guide there. I'll show you a quick picture so that you have the proper image. Sorry. So that's us entering Auschwitz I. You know, Auschwitz was divided into 2 sections. This is Auschwitz I, which was a former Polish military barracks. It was very easy for the Germans to set up. And then at Auschwitz II, this is unfortunately the remains of the gas chamber and crematoria. Just in the next picture right here, there are many memorial plaques. This is the one in English. I led Kaddish at this spot. I must say that was that was the most emotionally overwhelming part of the trip. I sort of felt a sense of responsibility in the moment to be leading Kaddish at this place. I was facing straight ahead, so I didn't see all the people behind me. I turned around and everybody was in tears. Starting to get a little emotional now. So a very, very, very tough moment of the trip. I will say one thing about Auschwitz that I didn't understand, and that was really the mechanics. And this leads me to the last part of this part of the presentation. Auschwitz was obviously a death camp, but it was also a labor camp. The idea was that at any given time, there would be 100,000 people there who were propelling the German war effort. They were slave labor for the German war effort. So the concept here was that they needed a huge number of barracks and a huge operation, because it wasn't just about the reason they killed off those that they didn't think could work or couldn't work anymore. But the idea here was to keep at all times 100,000 people who could be engaged in the war effort. So when you come to Auschwitz, everything that you see, all the pieces of what was left are left because this was an effort to keep people there and to keep them working. So 7,500 people were found in the camp when it was liberated. And you know, evidence like the shoes, the suitcases, the eyeglasses, the pots, the brushes, everything, it's because this was all there and left at the end of the war. And I say this all to contrast this with Auschwitz. Auschwitz is another camp that we went to, and it's completely different and almost, in my opinion, more powerful because it doesn't have any evidence of life. This shoes, while it's representing death, it's also somehow representing its owners, who, you know, each of them had an identity. Auschwitz is a different place. Auschwitz is a camp that in 1943, so Auschwitz was a camp that it was an extermination camp, and it looked to kill everybody in a region. 500,000 people were 500,000 Jews were exterminated at this death camp, and 2 survived. It was incredibly, incredibly efficient. And once they had liquidated the entire area, there's not a single Jew left in this area of southeastern Poland, they closed the camp. And that was in 1943. Not only did they close the camp, but they completely covered over their tracks, and they planted trees. So there's absolutely no evidence of this camp. In 2004, AJC along with the government of Poland, decided to create a monument to this place where so many died, and of course many family members wanted to remember their family members at a place, and there was no place to do so. And we created this monument, which we visited. I'm going to show it to you, sorry. And this is it. This is the monument. It's meant to be a stone for all 500,000 people who were killed. This is the plaque that's there, which shows AJC and this project along with the government of Poland. There you see names of towns that were liquidated, which are around the perimeter of the memorial, and Lublin is the one right in front of you. So totally different from Auschwitz, and in many ways even more devastating, because it just had absolutely no evidence, and it shows complete liquidation. Oh, okay, so stop that share for a second and go on to the fifth and last theme. So the fifth and last theme is something I'm going to add to this. It actually has nothing to do with the Polish-Jewish exchange, but I thought as board members you might find it interesting. It's my own family journey. While I was in this part of the world, I decided to take a vacation to Lithuania. My goal was to see the beautiful city of Vilnius, and I can show you Vilnius. That's how I saw it. It's actually very similar to the view that I had as I was landing. Quite unbelievable. You know, looks a bit like Prague, and it didn't even look so dissimilar during Soviet times. And this was the hotel that I stayed at. Shout out to Larry Rutkowski, who is on the phone or on the Zoom call, and this was his suggestion, and he set me up with a guide and lots of advice. But the reason that I went there was, well, first of all, to kind of be able to compare that to Poland. Interestingly enough, it became a real stark contrast. As I mentioned before, Lithuania was a place that welcomed the Nazis. Why? Because the Soviets had already occupied them, and they saw the Nazis as their liberators from the Soviet Union. You have to be careful what you wish for. They ended up becoming an Axis power, and their very first step in becoming an Axis power and to show their loyalty to the Nazis was to kill the Jews. And it was the Lithuanians who killed the Jews, by and large. It was not the Nazis. And they did something that existed almost nowhere else, which was that they marched them out into pits. Just in the suburbs of Lithuania, they shot them and they fell into pits. You can only do that if you have the complete collaboration of the local population. Concentration camps are hidden. This is the way my guide explained it to me. Concentration camps are hidden. You don't see them, but these pits were obvious, and you had complete collaboration of the local population who actually carried out the killings. There was a ghetto in Vilnius with 30,000 people who all went through this procedure and were all killed. So obviously, very stark contrast, and put Poland in perspective in terms of what the Poles had done during the war. But that was not the reason that I went there. And actually, I can show you very quickly. This was the ghetto. So right here, where my cursor is where the hotel was. So I stayed right in the traditional Jewish quarter, and then you can see the few streets around it form the ghetto. So why did I go to Lithuania? I went to Lithuania because I went to visit my cousins that I had never met. This was an extraordinary family story. I didn't know of their existence until 2008. My grandmother left Poland, what was the Greater Poland at the time, in 1921. She left behind brothers and sisters. She really had very little contact with them. Many of them were much younger. In 1945, after the war, she found them. And she sent them money, and she sent them photos, and she sent them clothing. And they got in a huge amount of trouble. The KGB came and knocked on their door and said, why are you receiving photos like this? And why are you receiving money from capitalist America? And they wrote to my grandmother and said, never contact us again. And that story was lost in time, and my grandmother died in 1970. Fast forward to, so who was it? It was a brother and a sister. That's who was left after the war. And they happened to have settled in Vilnius. That was not our ancestral town, but that's where they settled after the war. Brother and a sister. Fast forward to 1993. The brother and his whole family moved to the United States, armed with these photos and with letters from my grandmother from 1945, desperate to find any trace of a family, and they couldn't. And it wasn't until 2008 that they found my father, and it turned out that they were living in Brooklyn. My father was living in Brooklyn. So it turned out that my father and his uncle were living a few miles apart for several years in Brooklyn in the 90s. I had no idea. The uncle passed away in the 90s, but it was his first cousins, my father's first cousins, who reached out to him, explained the story, and we reconnected. But what happened with, and that's been a wonderful flowering of a relationship, but what happened in Vilnius with the sister? Well, the sister passed away in the 80s, but her family lives on. Most of them moved to Israel. And this was an interesting piece of the story. In 1990, when communism ended, there was a fear. And what was the fear? The fear was that the Lithuanians were back, that the nationalism that existed before was going to rise up again. And just like in 1940, when the Nazis came in and the Lithuanians killed them, Lithuanians were going to become nationalistic again. And most of the Jewish community in Vilnius moved en masse to Israel, most of what was left. What's left in terms of my family are essentially two cousins, two brothers. One of them lived in Israel for years, but he moved back. So I was visiting with two brothers who are my second cousins, who I'd never met before. And I met them and their whole family. So these are my two second cousins in front of their house. The one in the middle is named Jacob, and the one on the right is named Anatoly. So the one in the middle, this is his house behind him. He's very successful. And as you can see, it looks like a very normal suburban kind of house. He lives in the suburbs of Vilnius. I spent the whole night with them, a very powerful evening. The one in the middle, Jacob, does not speak English, so I did that in translation through his son, who does speak English. But the one on the right was the one who lived in Israel. He was served in the Israeli army. He lived there for years. His Hebrew was perfect. So I had a common language with him, and I formed a bond with him. And the following day, he took me here. He took me to the grave of my great aunt, who it's the one he's standing over, and my first cousin once removed, my father's first cousin, who's on the right, who died in 1995 at a very young age, at 57. So that was not part of the trip, but it was really icing on the cake for me, a very, very powerful personal experience, and certainly an experience that speaks to the history of Jews during the 20th century, how families were ripped apart by the Holocaust, by communism. So very, very telling of a lot of what I experienced, very emblematic. I want to end by saying that all of us on the Polish Jewish Exchange Program were charged with being ambassadors. Part of the reason I'm doing this Zoom call is because I want others to experience what I experienced and how I experienced it, and to pass that idea along. There's a lot of stereotypes that float around about Poles and Polish Jewish history, and there's a lot more nuance to it than those stereotypes. And I think as AJC leaders, it's important that we're all focused on that and pass that correct message along. Secondly, if any of you want to go on this trip, which I highly, highly recommend, if you have, there's quite a number of leaders who've been actually. Stephanie, our president, has been, and Richard has been. If any of you want to go on this trip, I cannot recommend it more highly. Now that the minimum gift is $5,000 for the board, you're all qualified to go. So let me know. It's a matter of nominating you. It's quite a competitive process, but hopefully, if one year you're not selected, you could be selected in subsequent years. This Monday, AJC Live, my radio show, will be, the subject of that will be the Polish Exchange Program. I will be interviewing Sebastian, who's the director of our office in Central Europe, as well as Olga, who's the director of Forum for Dialogue, and one of the mission participants will be on as well. So I think you'll get a bit of a different flavor when you listen to the radio show, and certainly you'll be listening to it and hearing it from the actual people who are living it. Sebastian's the director of our office, but he is not Jewish. He is one of those people who feels that connection and feels that desire to rebuild a sense of what was lost, to understand what was lost, a duty to the Jewish community, Olga as well. And with that, I will end. I think I've gone over my time, for which I apologize. So I'm not sure there's time for any questions, but I feel really bad about that. So Jill, maybe unmute everybody. And if there are any burning questions, maybe we'll take one or two. If not, you can feel free to email me and I will, of course, respond. So any burning questions?
Scott, it's Beverly.
Yes. Hi, Beverly.
Hi. I would just ask, you know, your presentation was excellent and it sounds like it was a fabulous ask if you had a chance to read Deborah Lipstadt's article this week, I believe in the Times of Israel, where she was expressing her negative thoughts about Prime Minister Netanyahu's trying to have relations with Poland and Lithuania and Hungary in light of the anti-Semitism and how hypocritical it is. So, you know, what do we do with that? What's your reaction to that?
So I did read it, and certainly that is, it's related to the fact that she had just spent the week in Poland. She wasn't just there for the Krakow Festival. I also saw her at the Poland Museum. You know, she spent the week there, and she had heard a lot of the things that were going on. It's interesting because her article didn't say that we should be cutting off relations, or her article basically said we should be trumpeting those relations. And she has a point. She has a point. We're not pleased with what's going on.
Right.
You know, the situation is complicated and it's an issue of nuance. And certainly AJC taking a stand on Dr. Stolla was big. This group taking a stand in this way. You know, we prevailed upon a government minister, in a meeting with the government minister, to bring up this issue. It had been a friendly meeting up until then. And I think we need to continue to speak up when we see issues of concern. On the other hand, there are very good relations with Israel. They're very supportive of Israel in the EU. Poland is a member of the EU since 2004, and they've become a very important voice, and they're finding their voice. They're upset at how the European Union has pressed them in many ways over the years, either in terms of austerity or in terms of immigrants. And now that they're strong economically, prosperous, they're finding their voice. We want them to speak out when it comes to Israel. So, you know, it's a double-edged sword, and perhaps we shouldn't be so extend ourselves so much. But as Deborah said, there are ways to be supportive without being so overly supportive.
Right. As you said, it's complicated.
Yeah.
There's a lot that sounds similar to our relationship with Hungary and all of their complexity. The Poland Museum, when it first opened, the government, I believe, had said that every high school student in the country would have to visit at least once. Did you hear anything about that?
So the Poland Museum is not only visited by high school students, it's the second most visited museum in the country. So it's become a huge tourist mecca, which is big. And by the way, the first most visited museum is the other museum that I went to, which was the Warsaw Uprising Museum. Not the ghetto uprising, but just the uprising. So it is visited. People go there. As I say, 2 million people a year go to Auschwitz too, and high school students are required to go there. But we asked our guide about that, and I think we asked our guide at Auschwitz about that, but I think it applies to the Poland Museum. They go once. They go once as high school students, and they learn. But their feeling is, you know, while we're thinking about this all the time, and we're on this trip, and Jewish issues are ever present when we're on this trip, for most Poles, it's just like that ghetto wall. It's in the background. They don't notice it. They don't think about it. It's sort of just, it's there, it's a piece of who they are, and it doesn't really give them pause for thought in any way. It doesn't change their lives. And they don't go back. By and large, they don't go back. They've gone as high school students, and they're not going to go again. So, you know, I think the efforts of Forum for Dialogue with high school students to give the complexity of what existed before, the color, and in these towns, not just in a place like Warsaw or Krakow, but in every small town where, like Lublin, you may have had a third of the Jewish community. There's 43,000 people, one third of the Jewish community, and it was a multicultural town. So the Jews may have been a plurality. So sort of their work to give color to what existed before is, I think, a more important and a more personal effort than pressing them to keep going back to these museums, but they certainly go.
There's also a recent book by Lynn Olson, who writes on World War II. I'd always had a very, very negative impression of Poland. And what she presents in that book, including the Warsaw Uprising, which the Allies had sort of supported and then abandoned the Poles, was really, they were a remarkable country. And without them, I don't know that we would have won World War II.
Oh.
That's all.
Gigi, did you have a question?
And I just wanted to say that I'm so honored to be part of AJC Westchester. And thank you. You are so brilliant and such a blessing to all of us. And thank you so much for sharing this incredible trip that you had. And I wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you very much. Thank you all for being a part of this. And we will send a link. If you missed any of it or you want to pass it to somebody, we will send a link. You can watch it. Shabbat Shalom.